Hey everyone, welcome back. Today's video is going to sound like a gemstone documentary, but it's actually a story about money. Most people think gemstones rise in value for one reason: rarity. A stone is rare, so it becomes expensive. Simple. But when you study history like an archaeologist, not through jewelry catalogs, but through collapsed empires, broken currencies, and abandoned trade routes, you see something much more unsettling. Some stones didn't rise because they were rare. They rose because money stopped working. When monetary systems fail, value doesn't disappear. It moves into objects, into materials, into things that don't need permission from banks. Because the moment a currency loses trust, people stop asking, "What is this worth today?" and start asking a different question: what will still be worth something when the rules change? That single shift is why certain gemstones spike in value during inflation, war, and capital controls, and why the same stones collapse when systems stabilize again. This isn't a list of the prettiest gems, and it isn't a list of the most expensive. It's a list of the stones that behave like money, when money stopped behaving like money. And here's the part almost nobody sees coming. The number one stone on this list isn't a gemstone at all in the modern sense. It's something most people treat like a cheap metal, until the world gets nervous. In 2026, it can still be bought in small amounts by ordinary people. But historically, it was powerful enough to build empires, and dangerous enough that monetary systems quietly demoted it. And once you understand why that happened, you'll never look at gemstones the same way again. Ranked 10th, citrine, the gold-looking stone that rises when money starts lying. When a monetary system starts wobbling, the first thing people lose isn't cash, it's trust. You see it in history over and over. When coins get clipped, when banks freeze withdrawals, when inflation makes prices feel unreal, people don't run toward logic, they run toward objects, because objects don't need permission to exist. And that's where gemstones enter the story, not as beauty, but as portable belief. A quiet replacement for money when money starts behaving like a rumor. Now for our number 10 stone, we're starting with one that looks like wealth, but has spent most of its life being misunderstood. Citrine. Citrine is the gold-colored gem that rises whenever the public starts craving anything that feels stable, warm, and safe. And in unstable monetary eras, that psychological effect becomes a market force. Here's the twist. Most citrine on the market is not naturally citrine at all. True natural citrine is a variety of quartz, silicon dioxide, colored by trace iron. It forms in hydrothermal environments, often in the same geological families as amethyst. But the majority of citrine sold worldwide is actually heat-treated amethyst, sometimes heated so aggressively it becomes a burnt orange-brown. That isn't illegal, but it changes the entire rarity story. And in a monetary system, the story matters more than the stone. Citrine is extracted primarily from quartz-bearing deposits, often through open-pit mining or small-scale operations. Brazil dominates the supply chain alongside Madagascar, Bolivia, and parts of Africa. It's not mined like diamond. It's mined like a trade material. Bulk, consistent, scalable, which means when economies tighten and buyers downgrade from luxury gems, citrine doesn't disappear. It floods. Citrine's most desirable tones in the market are pale champagne yellow, warm honey, rich golden amber. In cuts, you'll usually see ovals, cushions, emerald cuts, and rounds because citrine is quartz, hard enough for daily wear and easy to shape. It's typically clean, transparent, and bright. And that brightness is exactly why it behaves like a monetary mirror. Because when paper money starts feeling weak, the public begins hunting for anything that resembles gold, even psychologically. In 2026, citrine remains one of the most affordable mainstream gemstones. Typical ranges you'll see: commercial citrine, $5 to $30 per carat. Better color, clean, well cut, $30 to $80 per carat. Truly fine natural citrine, $100 to $300 plus per carat. Sometimes more if provenance is credible. But here's the part that makes this stone dangerous. When monetary systems wobble, sellers often reframe citrine as a wealth stone. The market becomes emotional. And emotional markets invite inflation. Not the economic kind, the story kind. If you study trade collapses, Roman debasement, medieval coin shortages, post-war black markets, you see the same behavior. People stop asking, what is this worth? And start asking, will this still be worth something later? Citrine thrives in that gap, not because it's rare, not because it's elite, but because it looks like stability when stability's missing. And if you've ever wondered why certain gemstones spike during monetary stress, this is your first clue. Sometimes value isn't geological. Sometimes it's what people reach for when money stops feeling real. Ranked 9th, Garnet, the blood-red gem that used to pay for wars. If citrine is what people buy when money starts lying, then garnet is what people carried when money started dying. Because garnet isn't a modern fashion gem. It's older than most nations, older than most banking systems. And in the archaeological record, garnet appears in the one place you don't expect gemstones to appear, inside the machinery of power. When currencies fail, gemstones don't become valuable because they're pretty. They become valuable because they're recognized. And for centuries, garnet was one of the most recognized stones in the Old World. In early medieval Europe, especially between the 5th and 8th centuries, there were periods where coin circulation shrank, not because people stopped trading, but because centralized mints weakened, empires fractured, and metal supply chains broke. When that happens, value moves away from coins and toward objects that carry status and trust. And garnet was one of the first stones to fill that gap. It wasn't a gemstone. It was a signal. You see it in Frankish burials, Anglo-Saxon jewelry, and elite military ornaments. Garnet inlay, garnet cloisonné, garnet set into gold. Not to look rich, to prove you were rich, when coins couldn't do that job anymore. Garnet isn't one stone, it's a family, and that's the first reason its value rises and falls with monetary systems. The public thinks garnet means one thing, but the market contains many. Almandine, deep red, most common. Pyrope, rich red, often higher value. Spessartine, orange. Savorit, green, high-end. Demantoid, green, rare, collector grade. Garnet is mined worldwide. India, Sri Lanka, Tanzania, Madagascar, Mozambique, Russia, Namibia. A lot of it comes from small-scale mining, which means the supply isn't controlled like diamonds. It's responsive. When economies struggle, more people mine. When economies recover, many miners disappear. That creates a market rhythm that looks disturbingly similar to currency cycles. Garnet's classic identity is the deep red, not ruby red, but blood red. And that color matters, because across cultures, red stones get tied to strength, sacrifice, loyalty, survival, and yes, war cut-wise, garnet is usually seen as ovals, rounds, cushions, antique cuts in vintage jewelry. It's often eye-clean, with a heavy, serious glow rather than sparkle, which makes it psychologically perfect for unstable eras. It doesn't look playful, it looks permanent. Here's where the modern monetary system shows up again. In 2026, garnet has two completely different markets. One, mass market garnet, almandine, $5 to $40 per carat, widely available, often sold in bulk jewelry too. High-grade collector garnet, pyrope, demantoid, savorit, $200 to $2,000 plus per carat depending on type, color, and origin. Scarcity matters, provenance matters. So what happens when monetary systems wobble? People don't rush to the complicated, expert-only stones. They rush to the stones they can recognize instantly, and that means cheap garnet often spikes in demand. Even though it isn't rare, when you excavate periods of monetary weakness, you see a strange thing. Gold becomes harder to move, coins become suspicious, and trade starts relying on items that are recognizable, durable, portable, and socially accepted. Garnet fits perfectly. It's not the best gemstone. It's not the rarest. It's the one people already agreed on. And here's the part most gem channels never say out loud. When money collapses, garnet doesn't rise because it's valuable. It rises because it's cheap enough for everyone to grab. That's the terrifying truth of monetary fear. In the moments when people stop trusting currency, the winning stones aren't always the elite ones. Sometimes the real winners are the gemstones that can become mass belief overnight. And garnet is one of the few stones in history that has already done it before. Ranked 8th, turquoise, the stone that lost value when its culture lost power. If garnet was the stone of armies, then turquoise was the stone of civilizations. Not because it was the most expensive, not because it was the rarest, but because, for a very long time, turquoise was treated like something money could never replace. And if you want to understand why gemstone value rises and falls with monetary systems, turquoise is one of the clearest archaeological case studies ever recorded. Because turquoise didn't collapse in value due to a discovery, or a treatment, or a flood of supply. It collapsed because something far more violent happened. The world stopped respecting the people who made it sacred. In many societies, turquoise wasn't jewelry. It was a status code, sometimes even a religious one. You see it in ancient Egypt, inlays and royal ornament. Persia and Central Asia, protective and elite symbolism. Mesoamerica, Aztec and Mixtec mosaics. And most famously, indigenous cultures of the American Southwest. For these cultures, turquoise functioned like a form of stored value, not in banks, but in social memory. When a monetary system is weak, social memory becomes the real currency, and turquoise thrives in those conditions. How it's mined and why turquoise behaves like fragile money. Turquoise forms when copper-rich water interacts with aluminum and phosphorus minerals, usually in arid environments. That means turquoise is born from scarcity, not deep underground like diamond, not volcanic like ruby, but near the surface, in the harsh zones where civilizations struggle to survive. Major sources include Iran, Persian turquoise, historically elite, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, classic American turquoise, China, large-scale supply in modern times. Mexico and Egypt, historically mining is usually small-scale, often in narrow veins, and turquoise is soft compared to most gemstones, around 5 to 6 on Mohs. It can crack, it can dry out, it can absorb oils, it can change color, which is why it became the perfect money stone in ancient life. It wasn't just valuable, it was high maintenance. And high maintenance objects are the ones people protect hardest when times feel unstable. Color, shape, and the psychology of trust turquoise isn't valued for brilliance. It's valued for a color that looks like it should not exist in stone. Sky blue, robin's egg, green blue, sometimes with webbing matrix like a map. Turquoise is usually cut as cabochons, beads, carved pieces, inlay segments. Not because cutters lack skill, but because turquoise is about surface identity, not sparkle. And that matters. Because in monetary history, the objects people trust most are the ones that look unmistakable from a distance. Turquoise is instantly recognizable. That's a form of economic power. In 2026, turquoise is one of the most confusing gemstone markets on Earth. You have low-grade turquoise /stabilized/dyed, often $1 to $20 per carat equivalent. Mass jewelry, heavy treatments, sold as turquoise, but behaves like a different material, high-grade natural turquoise, old mines, rare colors, can reach $100 to $500 plus per carat equivalent, sometimes more for famous origins like high-end Persian or rare American mine material. And here's the modern monetary pattern. When inflation rises and consumers panic, demand surges for recognizable stones. But turquoise has a problem. Most of the turquoise people can afford is not the turquoise that made history. Turquoise was never just traded. It was carried. It was worn as protection, given as alliance, used as proof of kinship, which means turquoise's value was anchored in culture, not economics. And culture is a stronger foundation than money, until culture loses power. And here's the brutal truth. Turquoise didn't fall because the stone became common. Turquoise fell because the world stopped paying for the meaning behind it. When indigenous cultures were pushed out of power, their sacred stone was rebranded into a tourist object. Same mineral, same color, but the authority that made it money was gone. So turquoise is one of the only gemstones in history that proves this. A gemstone can lose value even when it stays rare, because the rarest thing in any monetary system is not the stone. It's the civilization that can make the world agree what the stone means. Ranked 7th, amber, the ancient oil that became a souvenir. When monetary systems weaken, people don't just hoard money. They hoard things that feel like certainty. And history has a strange habit of repeating itself. When coins fail, trade routes matter more. When trade routes matter more, certain materials become power. That's where amber enters the story, because amber isn't a gemstone in the normal sense. It's not crystal. It's not mineral. Amber is fossilized tree resin. And in the ancient world, that made it something far more valuable than jewelry. It made it a substance that could move across borders like fuel. The monetary link, why amber rose when money was fragile. If you study early European trade, especially from the Bronze Age into Roman times, you find amber everywhere, but not where it forms. You find it in graves, in elite ornaments, in distant markets. And that tells you something crucial. Amber was not bought. It was moved. And anything that moves reliably during unstable monetary eras becomes a form of currency. That's why historians talk about the Amber Road, a trade artery connecting the Baltic region to the Mediterranean world. When coin systems were inconsistent, when empires rose and fell, amber still traveled. Because amber didn't require a stable bank. It required only one thing, agreement. How it's sourced and why supply behaves like an energy market. The most famous source is Baltic amber, Lithuania, Poland, Kaliningrad. Amber can be mined, but it's also collected. From coastal erosion, from sediment layers, from shallow deposits exposed by storms, that makes amber supply unusually responsive to nature. In some years, storms create abundance. In others, the coast gives nothing. So amber behaves less like a gemstone and more like an ancient commodity, like salt, like oil, like a resource that arrives in waves. Amber is loved for a reason that minerals can't imitate. It looks organic. It comes in honey gold, deep cognac, cherry red, often treated, milky butter amber, and rare greens and blues. It's usually cut as beads, cabochons, carved amulets, raw polished chunks. Amber is light in the hand, warm to the touch, and can hold static electricity. Ancient people noticed that. They didn't call it science. They called it power, which is why amber became one of the earliest materials to sit in the same psychological category as money. Something you could carry that felt more real than coins. In 2026, amber sits in a fractured market. Mass market amber, often $1 to $20 per gram. Common beads, tourist pieces, sometimes reconstituted or treated high-grade natural Baltic amber, $20 to $100 plus per gram, depending on clarity, color, and craftsmanship. Insect inclusions / rare specimens can reach hundreds to thousands for collectors, especially for scientific grade or exceptional display pieces. But amber has a modern problem that didn't exist in antiquity. Fake amber is everywhere. Plastic, copal, young resin, and pressed amber flood the market, which means amber's value today depends heavily on authority, lab tests, provenance, and trust. And that brings us back to monetary systems again, because when money is strong, consumers demand proof. When money is weak, consumers demand feeling. Amber sells in both worlds, but for completely different reasons. The archaeological pattern, amber as portable fuel. In ancient trade collapses, amber rises because it functions like a commodity. Easy to transport, culturally recognized, emotionally powerful, and useful for ornament, ritual, and exchange. Amber was the oil of its age, not because it powered machines, but because it powered roots. And here's the brutal twist. Amber didn't fall because people stopped loving it. Amber fell because money got better. Once stable currencies and modern banking systems expanded, amber stopped being a trade necessity and became a gift shop material. Same substance, same glow. But now, instead of being carried by merchants and kings across continents, it's sold in plastic trays under fluorescent lights. Amber is one of the clearest proofs in gemstone history that, when monetary systems strengthen, certain stones don't rise. They get downgraded, not because they lost beauty, because they lost their job. Ranked 6th. Lapis Lazuli, the blue that once controlled empires. When money collapses, people reach for objects. When money stabilizes, people reach for systems. But in the ancient world, there was a period when an object was the system. Not gold, not silver, a color. And that color had a name. Lapis Lazuli. If turquoise was identity and amber was trade fuel, lapis was something colder, sharper, and more dangerous. Imperial authority. Because lapis didn't just decorate power. For thousands of years, lapis helped define it. The monetary link, a stone that moved like currency. To understand lapis, you have to understand one fact that shows up in every archaeological record. Lapis was rarely found where it was used. It was found in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and later Europe. But it came from a place most ancient elites would never see, Badakhshan, Afghanistan. That deposit is one of the oldest continuously exploited gemstone sources in human history. And that's why lapis behaves like a monetary system. Because when a material depends on a single remote supply chain, its value rises and falls with political stability, trade routes, and the power of whoever controls access. In other words, lapis was not priced like a gem. It was priced like a geopolitical asset. How it's mined and why it was never just jewelry. Lapis is not a single mineral. It's a rock, mostly lazurite, with calcite and pyrite, and it's mined in harsh mountainous terrain, often through difficult manual extraction. Historically, this wasn't a gem mine. It was a strategic location. Because if you controlled lapis, you controlled elite ornament, religious artifacts, royal seals, and later the most expensive pigment in the world. So the mining story is inseparable from monetary systems. Lapis supply didn't expand because demand rose. It expanded only when empires allowed it. Color, shape, and why lapis looked like a throne. Lapis is valued for a blue that feels almost unnatural. Deep ultramarine, midnight blue, with gold pyrite flecks like stars, and sometimes white calcite streaks. The best lapis is intensely saturated, minimal calcite, and fine pyrite. Cut-wise, lapis is usually cabochons, beads, inlay slabs, carvings. Not because it can't sparkle, but because lapis doesn't need sparkle. Lapis was never trying to look like money. It was trying to look like heaven. And when rulers can claim heaven, they don't need coins to prove they're in charge. Price in 2026, the modern downgrade. In 2026, lapis sits in a strange position. It is globally known, but no longer globally feared. Typical ranges: commercial lapis, $1 to $10 per carat equivalent. Good quality, deep blue, $10 to $50 per carat equivalent. Exceptional royal blue lapis, $50 to $150 plus per carat equivalent, sometimes higher in fine jewelry. But compared to its historical role, that's the shocking part. Lapis used to be a stone that kings treated like a state resource. Now it's often sold beside souvenir carvings. So what happened? The archaeological pattern. Lapis as a currency of control. In ancient economies, lapis was valuable for one reason. It was the only reliable source of that blue. Not a preference, a monopoly. And monopolies behave like money. When trade routes broke, lapis disappeared from elite sites. When routes reopened, lapis returned. It rose and fell with systems, just like currency. And here's the brutal twist. Lapis didn't lose value because it became common. Lapis lost value because its most important function was replaced. For centuries, the true wealth of lapis wasn't the stone. It was the pigment made from it. Ultramarine. Painters used lapis to create the blue of sacred robes, royal skies, divine halos. And that blue was expensive enough to be treated like a financial asset. Then the global monetary system matured. Industrial chemistry arrived, and suddenly the most powerful blue on earth could be manufactured for pennies. So Lapis didn't collapse because people stopped loving blue. It collapsed because globalization did what globalization always does. It took a symbol of power and mass-produced it into decoration. And that is one of the clearest laws of gemstone value. A stone rises when it controls a function. A stone falls when the world invents a cheaper replacement. Ranked fifth, coral, the Mediterranean hard money that became a legal risk. When monetary systems weaken, people return to old instincts. They don't just look for value. They look for value that feels physical, something you can hold, something you can trade, something that doesn't vanish when governments change rules overnight. For centuries around the Mediterranean, one material played that role so perfectly, it behaved like a kind of hard money. Not gold, not silver, coral. And if you want a gemstone whose value rose and fell with monetary systems, coral is one of the most revealing, because its rise wasn't based on luxury. It was based on trust and circulation. The monetary link, coral as portable coin, in jewelry form coral, especially red coral, was not just worn. It was used as dowry wealth, trade goods, status proof, and in some regions, a kind of wearable savings account. In coastal Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, coral moved through markets like currency because it solved a problem every weak monetary system creates. Coins can be clipped, paper can be forged, banking can freeze. But coral is hard to fake convincingly without modern materials. It is instantly recognizable, and it carries cultural weight. That's exactly what money needs. How coral is sourced and why it behaved like a controlled supply. Here's the key difference between coral and most gemstones. Coral is not mined, it is harvested. The most famous money coral is red precious coral, Corallium rubrum, historically taken from the Mediterranean, Italy, Sardinia, Tunisia, Algeria. For centuries, coral harvesting was dangerous, seasonal, and limited by geography. That created a natural supply cap, and supply caps create price stability. The same thing stable monetary systems promise. So coral became a substitute for stable money in places and periods where money was unstable. Color, shape, and the psychology of real value. Coral is valued for one thing, color that looks like life. Deep blood red, salmon red, sometimes pinkish tones, occasionally white or black corals, different markets. It's typically shaped into beads, cabochons, carved cameos, branches polished into pendants. Coral doesn't sparkle, it doesn't refract, it doesn't need to, because coral doesn't sell the fantasy of wealth. It sells the feeling of inherited wealth. And in monetary history, inherited wealth is always seen as safer than earned money. Price in 2026 and why the market is split by fear. In 2026, coral has two realities: common coral / dyed, coral / imitation. Low cost, widely sold, often not precious coral at all. Genuine precious red coral, Mediterranean origin, can reach hundreds to thousands of dollars per finished piece. And in bead form, can be extremely expensive depending on size and uniformity. But unlike most gemstones, coral pricing isn't only about beauty. It's about documentation, origin, legality, and the risk of owning or trading it across borders, which means coral now behaves like something modern investors recognize immediately, a regulated asset. The archaeological pattern, coral as human money. In excavation records, coral appears in places where maritime trade was strong, coin systems were inconsistent, and jewelry served as portable wealth. Coral beads show up like savings, not because people loved coral more than other materials, because coral was trusted to stay valuable across regimes. It was the Mediterranean version of hard money, but worn on the body. And here's the brutal twist. Coral didn't stop being valuable. It stopped being safe. As conservation laws tightened worldwide, as endangered species protections expanded, coral became one of the only gem materials that can turn into a legal problem. So the very feature that once made coral behave like hard money, its controlled supply, now creates something darker. Uncertainty. A stone that used to be a shelter from unstable systems is now vulnerable to a different kind of system. Global regulation. And that's the modern law of value. Sometimes a gemstone doesn't fall because demand disappears. It falls because the world decides the material is no longer morally tradable. Coral is the rare case where a safe haven asset can become a liability overnight. Ranked fourth. Jade, the dynasty stone that became a speculation market. When people think of jade, they imagine beauty, green bangles, smooth carvings, a quiet, elegant stone. But if you step back, far back, into the archaeological record, jade is not a fashion gem. Jade is a political instrument. For thousands of years, jade functioned as something far more powerful than jewelry, a dynastic monetary system, not printed, not minted, but enforced through culture, ritual, and hierarchy. The monetary link. Jade as state-backed value. In many Chinese dynasties, jade was treated like a material with moral authority. Gold could be stolen, silver could be melted, coins could be counterfeited. But jade had something coins never had: ritual legitimacy. Jade was used in burial suits, imperial seals, ceremonial discs, BI, symbolic weapons, court gifts, and tribute systems. That means jade wasn't only wealth, it was proof of alignment with power. And in any monetary system, the most valuable currency is the one backed by authority. For centuries, jade was exactly that. What jade actually is and why the market confuses people. Here's where modern money enters the story again. Jade is not one material. There are two. Jadeite, rarer, higher value, harder. Nephrite, more common historically, still culturally important. Jadeite became the modern obsession, especially in high-end markets, because it can reach colors that look unreal. Imperial green, vivid emerald tones, icy translucent white. Lavender and jadeite's best material is concentrated in one place that matters economically: Myanmar, which means jade value is tied to politics, borders, and control, just like currency. How it's mined and why jade behaves like shadow banking. Jadeite mining in Myanmar is brutal, chaotic, and historically linked to unstable governance, conflict zones, and opaque supply chains. That matters because jade doesn't enter the market like diamonds. It enters like something older, smuggled wealth. And in monetary history, smuggled wealth always rises when trust in institutions weakens. When currencies feel unstable, the wealthy don't always buy gold. They buy objects that can cross borders quietly. Jade excels at that. Color, shape, and why jade feels like stored time. Jade is not valued for sparkle. It's valued for smoothness, translucency, saturation, and a kind of internal glow. The most common forms: bangles, the ultimate status object; cabochons, beads, carved pendants. And unlike most gems, jade is not primarily about cut. It's about material integrity. One fracture can destroy the value, which is why jade carries a psychological weight that money systems love. It feels like something you either own properly or you don't own at all. Price in 2026? The market split is extreme. In 2026, jade has one of the widest price ranges in the entire gemstone world. Commercial jade, $5 to $100 for finished pieces. Decent natural jade, hundreds to thousands, fine jadeite cabochons. $5,000 to $50,000 plus top Imperial jaded. Auction level, sometimes 6 to 7 figures. And here's the key. Those top prices aren't driven by jewelry demand. They're driven by wealth behavior. Jade becomes more attractive when people fear currency devaluation, capital controls, or political uncertainty, which means jade behaves like a parallel financial system. The archaeological pattern. Jade as dynastic money. Jade was once the stone of dynasties because it was controlled by dynasties. It was the physical symbol of who had the right to rule. And when a dynasty weakened, jade's role shifted, but it never vanished, because the belief never vanished. And here's the brutal modern truth. Jade didn't die when modern monetary systems rose. It got upgraded into something colder, a speculation market. In dynastic times, jade was wealth because it represented stability. In modern times, jade becomes wealth because it represents escape. Escape from inflation, escape from banking transparency, escape from rules. So jade is one of the only gemstones in history that proves this. A stone can survive the death of an empire and still become a weapon inside the next system. Not because jade is rare, because jade is one of the few materials that can still carry value even when the world stops agreeing on what money is. Ranked third, onyx. The authority stone that couldn't survive mass imitation. When monetary systems wobble, people don't only buy what's rare, they buy what looks like authority. They buy objects that feel like they belong in courtrooms, temples, and old government buildings. Objects that signal control. And for a long stretch of human history, one stone did that job almost perfectly. Not diamond, not ruby, onyx. Onyx is the stone of seals, rings, stamps, cameos, and official-looking ornament. It doesn't sparkle, it doesn't seduce, it commands. And that's why it rose whenever money systems became unstable. Because in unstable systems, people stop trusting currency and start trusting symbols. The monetary link, why onyx behaved like institutional wealth. In ancient and classical societies, onyx and related banded agates were used for signet rings, identity and authorization, carved seals, ownership and contracts, cameos, elite portrait power, official gifts and prestige objects. This is critical because a seal is not decoration. A seal is a financial tool. It's how trade, property, and agreements survive when coins are unreliable. So onyx became valuable not because it was the most beautiful stone, but because it was part of the infrastructure of trust. What onyx really is and why the modern market is messy. Here's the uncomfortable part. Most black onyx in modern jewelry isn't naturally black. Onyx is a variety of banded chalcedony, microcrystalline quartz. It naturally forms with bands, often in whites, browns, grays. True naturally black onyx exists, but it is far less common. So what does the market do? It dyes. And dyeing onyx is not difficult. It has been done for a long time, which means onyx is one of the earliest stones to suffer from the same disease as weak money, easy replication. How it's sourced and why supply exploded. Onyx and agate are found in many regions. India, Brazil, Madagascar, Mexico, parts of Africa. It's mined in large quantities, often as industrial lapidary material, not elite extraction. And that matters, because when a stone becomes easy to extract and easy to treat, it stops behaving like a store of value and starts behaving like a manufactured product. That is exactly what happened to onyx. Color, shape, and why it was perfect for power. Onyx's appeal is psychological. It's black, solid, minimal, formal, readable from a distance, and it is cut into shapes that scream authority. Signet faces, flat tablets, beads, cabochons, cameos. Onyx doesn't look like romance, it looks like a signature, and that's why it rose in periods when people wanted order. Price in 2026, and why it can't hold value anymore. In 2026, onyx is inexpensive. Commercial onyx, $1 to $10 per carat equivalent. Better cut or large clean pieces, $10 to $30. High craftsmanship cameos can be valuable, but that's the carving, not the stone. So why did it fall so hard? Because onyx lost its monopoly on authority aesthetics. Modern money systems didn't just stabilize currencies, they industrialized symbols. Now anyone can buy authority for pennies. Black glass, resin, ceramic, dyed agate. Even plastic onyx became one option in a sea of perfect fakes. The archaeological pattern, onyx as a tool of trust. In the past, if you had an onyx seal ring, you weren't just wealthy, you were recognized. You had legal presence. That made onyx valuable in the same way official documents are valuable. But documents lost power when copies became perfect. And onyx lost power when imitation became effortless. And here's the final twist. Onyx didn't fall because it became ugly. Onyx fell because it became too easy to look like onyx. It was an authority stone in a world where authority was scarce. But modern monetary systems created something new: mass-produced authority. And once authority became something you could buy in bulk, onyx stopped being a store of value and became a costume. A gemstone that once helped hold contracts together couldn't survive the one invention that destroys every weak currency: perfect imitation. Ranked second, ruby, the gem that becomes money when borders start closing. When monetary systems weaken, the public buys comfort. But when war begins, the wealthy buy something else: escape. Because in wartime, money has a problem no gemstone has. Money belongs to a system, and systems can be seized. Accounts can be frozen, gold can be confiscated, currency can be devalued overnight. So throughout modern history, when conflict spreads, certain gemstones stop being jewelry and become portable exit strategies. And no gemstone has played that role more consistently than ruby. The monetary link: why ruby rises when war rises. Ruby is one of the few stones that is recognized globally, instantly. You don't need an expert to understand the signal. A vivid red ruby is read as wealth, power, seriousness, permanence. And in unstable times, recognition is everything. Because a gemstone that can't be recognized quickly is not a financial tool, it's a hobby. Ruby, unlike many collector stones, works like money because it can be traded across cultures without translation. Where ruby comes from and why its value is political: ruby is corundum, aluminum oxide, colored red by chromium. It forms under specific geological conditions, and fine material is geographically concentrated. Historically and today, the most famous sources include Myanmar, Burma, legendary Mogok Prestige, Thailand/Cambodia, historically important trade hubs, Sri Lanka, often lighter, pinkish tones, Mozambique, major modern supply, Madagascar, variable, sometimes fine. And here's the key: ruby is not just mined, ruby is controlled. Because many major ruby sources sit in regions with political instability, sanctions, or conflict-adjacent supply chains. That means ruby pricing doesn't behave like a normal luxury market. It behaves like a wartime commodity. Mining and the uncomfortable truth of scarcity, ruby is extracted through small-scale pit mining, gravel washing, tunnel mining in older regions, mechanized operations in newer deposits. But the real scarcity is not how much ruby exists. The real scarcity is how much ruby can enter the market cleanly, legally, and consistently. In war-adjacent economies, supply becomes unpredictable. An unpredictable supply is one of the fastest ways to create price spikes. It's the gemstone version of an oil shock. Color, cut, and the refuge asset: look, rubies are valued by the 4 C's. But with ruby, color dominates everything. The most prized is vivid rich red, strong saturation, minimal brown, minimal purple, good transparency, cut shapes, oval, cushion, round, and mixed cuts that maximize color. But unlike diamonds, ruby doesn't need brilliance to look expensive. Ruby's value is felt the moment you see the color, and that is why it becomes a crisis stone. Because in a crisis, nobody has time to analyze sparkle. They want a signal: price in 2026, and why the ceiling keeps moving. In 2026, ruby pricing is brutally split. Commercial ruby, $20 to $200 per carat fine ruby, good color, clean, $1,000 to $10,000 per carat. Top Burmese quality, unheated, vivid red, $50,000 to $500,000 plus per carat in extreme cases. And that sounds insane, until you understand what the top tier really is. It isn't jewelry, it's flight capital. The kind of wealth you can hide in a pocket, walk across a border with, and sell without needing a bank. The archaeological pattern: ruby as a war stone. In ancient records, rubies appear in royal treasuries. In modern records, they appear in something darker: private vaults, emergency wealth, and shadow markets. Because ruby's real superpower isn't beauty, it's portability. And portability becomes priceless when systems turn hostile. And here's the brutal truth most people don't want to admit: ruby doesn't rise only because it's beautiful. Ruby rises because war turns it into a financial weapon. When currencies weaken, people buy gold. But when borders start closing, the ultra-wealthy buy something smaller than gold. Something that doesn't ring metal detectors the same way. Something that can be hidden, carried, and liquidated quietly. That's why ruby doesn't behave like a luxury. It behaves like a passport you can hold in your hand. And that is the real reason ruby's value rises and falls with monetary systems. When peace returns, ruby is jewelry again. But when war returns, ruby becomes money. In first place, emerald. The gem that rises when money needs somewhere to hide. When monetary systems weaken, most people buy what feels safe. Gold, cash, real estate. But when monetary systems become dangerous, when governments tighten controls, when banks start watching every transaction, when capital needs to move quietly, the wealthy don't just look for safety, they look for containers, objects that can store value without leaving a paper trail. And that's where emerald becomes something far darker than jewelry. Because emerald is one of the few gemstones in history that can function like a financial instrument, a portable vault, the monetary link. Why emerald rises in the shadow economy? Emerald has been traded for over 2,000 years, but its modern behavior is tied to something very specific. Emerald value spikes when currencies lose credibility, capital controls tighten, banking transparency increases, and geopolitical pressure rises. Because emerald is not standardized like gold. It's not traceable like a bank transfer. And unlike many gems, it has a global prestige signal. A fine emerald is recognized instantly in Dubai, New York, Hong Kong, or Geneva. That recognition makes it tradable under stress. And stress is where monetary systems reveal their weaknesses. Where emerald comes from and why the supply is political. Emerald is beryl colored by chromium and vanadium, but the world doesn't treat all emeralds equally. The most famous source is Colombia. And Colombian emerald isn't just a gemstone origin. It's a historical supply chain shaped by colonial extraction, cartel-era violence, conflict zones, and modern high-security mining. Other important sources exist. Zambia, often cleaner, cooler green. Brazil, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, more recent. But the market's authority still circles back to Colombia. And whenever a gemstone's prestige depends on a single region, its value begins to behave like currency. Because currency is also regional authority. Mining and the uncomfortable truth of scarcity emerald mining is not like diamond mining. Emerald forms in narrow, unpredictable veins. You can remove tons of rock and find nothing. Then suddenly, one pocket produces stones worth millions. That creates a market that behaves like speculation, because the supply is never smooth. And when supply is never smooth, price becomes emotional, which is exactly what unstable monetary systems create. Emotional pricing. Color, shape, and why emerald looks like serious money emerald is valued for. Rich green saturation, a slightly bluish tone in top material, and a glow that looks almost wet. But unlike diamond, emerald is expected to have inclusions. Those inclusions are called garden. And that's important psychologically, because emerald doesn't look manufactured, it looks natural. In an era where money is digital and abstract, people crave natural proof. Emerald is cut most often as emerald cuts for protection, ovals, cushions, sometimes cabochons in lower clarity, and almost all emerald is oiled or treated to some degree, which adds another layer. Emerald value is not just beauty, it's trust. Price in 2026, and why it's one of the most violent price curves. In 2026, emerald pricing ranges from ordinary to absurd. Commercial emerald, $50 to $500 per carat. Fine emerald, $2,000 to $15,000 per carat. Top Colombian, vivid, well-cut, documented, $20,000 to $100,000 plus per carat. Extreme stones, auction level, effectively priceless. And the reason for that ceiling isn't jewelry demand. It's wealth behavior. Emerald is purchased like a financial asset by people who don't trust financial assets. The archaeological pattern, emerald is a green currency. In ancient Egypt and Rome, emerald signaled royalty. In modern times, it signals something colder: mobility. Emerald is what wealth becomes when wealth wants to travel without permission. And here's the brutal truth. Emerald doesn't rise only because it's beautiful. Emerald rises because modern monetary systems created a new problem. Money became too visible. When banks watch, when governments track, when borders tighten, when sanctions hit, emerald becomes the answer for people who need wealth to survive outside the system. So emerald is not just a gem, it's what money turns into when money becomes a liability. And that's why emerald's value rises and falls with monetary systems. When the system feels safe, emerald is jewelry. When the system feels hostile, emerald becomes a hiding place. Tonight, we didn't just look at gemstones. We looked at what happens when money stops behaving like money. Because across history, value has never been purely geological. It's been political, cultural, and sometimes desperate. Citrine rose when people needed warmth. Garnet rose when power needed symbols. Turquoise fell when cultures lost authority. Amber became trade fuel, then a souvenir. Coral turned from hard money into legal risk. Jade survived dynasties by becoming speculation. Ruby became an exit strategy. Emerald became a hiding place. And in the end, silver reminded us of the most uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the system doesn't collapse. Sometimes it simply decides what counts as money and what doesn't. If you enjoyed this kind of history, leave a comment and tell me, which stone surprised you the most, and which one do you think would rise next? Good night, and I'll see you in the next one.